The 9 o'clock service was seen as the most exciting new movement in the Church of England, drawing in crowds of young people to a rave in a church.
And there'd be an ambient music beat going on, and everybody was talking, and some people were dancing, and some people were just chatting to each other, and there was a real buzz whenever you walked in. And then the service would start, and it was exciting and it was fun, and we felt as if God was there.
The 9 o'clock service, which began in Sheffield, was seen by many, including the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, as a model that should be replicated in every city. But for some in the movement, it was becoming something much darker.
It was basically a Church of England approved sex cult. Everything was about sex. The images, the dress code, the black bikinis, the sermons.
Now, 30 years after the 9 o'clock service collapsed, the man who founded and ran the movement, an ordained priest, has been found guilty of 17 counts of indecent assault. He was cleared of another 15 charges, and the jury was discharged after failing to reach verdicts on 5 further counts, including one of rape. What was happening inside the cult-like 9 o'clock service? Why was its charismatic leader never held accountable by the church? And what does it mean for the already beleaguered Church of England, mired by scandal and blamed for mishandling cases of historical sexual abuse? The story today: abuse inside the C of E's rave church.
I am Sean O'Neill, and I'm a senior writer at The Times.
Sean, when did you first come across this story?
I got a tip about 4 years ago, in fact, exactly 4 years ago, that a group of women who had been members of the 9 o'clock service in Sheffield back in the 80s and 90s were contemplating legal action against the Church of England over the way they'd been treated at the time. That, within a short period of time, kind of transformed into a criminal investigation. That they went to South Yorkshire Police, made reports of indecent assaults, sexual assaults, very serious sexual assaults. And that turned into a very long-running investigation that was, of course, hampered by pandemics and lockdowns and backlogs in the courts, and was eventually came to trial in London, at Inner London Crown Court at the end of June.
And we'll come back to the details of that court case. You've been following it very closely. Before we do, though, for people who won't remember this, including me, take us back to that moment in the 1980s. What was the 9 o'clock service? And if you were there, what did it feel like? What were you seeing? What were you surrounded by?
Well, the 9 o'clock service emerges at the time when the Sheffield music scene is quite vibrant. You have a group of quite young, dedicated Christians living in community in the Crooks area of Sheffield. They worship at St Thomas Crooks Church, which is a fairly traditional parish church, a solid old Victorian church building. But these people are kind of young and trendy, and they're into their music, and they have pink hair and DMs, and they don't fit the normal congregation.
Yeah, they're not going to join the WI anytime soon.
Yeah, and I think at one point they're feeling quite alienated from other members of the congregation. Indeed, I believe at one point somebody in the congregation questioned, why are these young people coming to church dressed like prostitutes?
Oof.
So the vicar at St Thomas at the time was a man called Reverend Robert Warren, who was head of evangelism for the Church of England. And he gave them permission to set up their own service. And the leader of this community was a man called Chris Brain. And Brain was into music. He had a Christian rock band called Tense. His wife was the singer in it. The various other members of the community participated in it. And they very quickly established that the time they could have their services was 9 o'clock on a Sunday evening. It became very known as the 9 o'clock service, or NOS. And it developed very, very rapidly into a very successful new type of worship, where they began drawing in dozens, then scores, then hundreds of young people every week. And it's been described mostly as a kind of nightclub church. So they had a sound system, they had strobe lighting, they had dancers, they had a live band. You know, one young woman who went there from school when she was a teenager told me, she said it was just like, you know, she'd been going to a traditional church and this just blew your mind. It was unbelievable. You know, everybody was dancing. It was very trancey, very ravey. It was all that time in the rave scene.
So a rave in a church hall?
It's basically a rave with a kind of a church service in the middle of it. They have, nobody leading the services or an ordained minister at this stage in the 80s, but they have visiting clergy coming to administer the sacrament of communion, and it really catches on. It catches fire, basically.
And when you say it catches on, I mean, just how big does it become?
We're talking 500, 600 people a week going to the services in a small church.
Wow.
So big it gets that it outgrows that church and eventually relocates to a place called the Rotunda in Sheffield city centre, which is like a huge room beneath the city swimming pool. And that's when things start to spin out of control a little bit, because they're away from the parish environment and there's no accountability to any kind of church authority, and Brain is very much the leader and kind of charismatic figure who dictates everything that happens.
And this is still officially a service.
It's still a service, and initially the church's answer to this idea that it's not within a parish boundary anymore is to fast-track Brain's ordination as a Church of England priest.
And we'll come to that in just a moment. Before we do that, I mean, clearly it's established itself as a presence on the Sheffield scene. Mm-hmm. People there have heard about it. How famous is it becoming across the board?
George Carey's heard of it. He's about to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he meets Brain and he tells Brain, I would like a NOS in every town and city in the country.
Wow.
Because the big thing is bringing young people into churches. And he invites Brain at one point to contribute a chapter to a book about evangelism. Now, Brain's chapter is like a lot of word salad about mysticism and religiosity, and it's just mumbo-jumbo, a lot of it. But they sort of look all beyond that, because it's just, look, he can draw young people in. Young people are coming to church. The pews are empty and suddenly they're full again, but they're not sitting down or kneeling down. They're dancing and they're raving and they're having a fantastic time.
And that is remarkable. This is exactly what the Church of England, they want the numbers. They want to see people coming back to church, even if it is in a very different form. He's clearly establishing a reputation within the church at this point for somebody who can do that, who can draw people in. What sort of people is he drawing in? You mentioned they're younger, pink-haired musicians, but who else? In
Sheffield, a lot of the people going to it are from the student community. So they're people who are at the university or other further education colleges. There are young professionals. The actual sort of the NOS group, if you like, you have like categories of this. There are people who come every week, and then there are people who are in NOS, who are part of the teams. There's a music team and a visuals team and a stage team and a lighting team.
Sort of run the organisation.
Yeah, and they kind of live in community. They're expected to contribute a portion of their income, no matter how small, to keep NOS going. One young woman, I spoke to the young woman who was at school, she was giving £10 a week from her pocket money.
Wow.
Or £10 a month, I beg your pardon. Just because you're expected to do that. So there's a lot of commitment. And we've had evidence from very successful people in their lives post-NOS in this trial. We've had a professor of medical engineering, we've had a head teacher, we've had doctors, teachers, physiotherapists. One of the reasons the trial was eventually moved out of Sheffield was because a former member of NOS was a senior barrister in Sheffield and would have been too well known to the judiciary and the bar in the city, so they couldn't have the trial there.
So it is sort of young, but very talented people.
Young, talented. I mean, the former Archdeacon of Sheffield said to me, these were outstanding young people.
Mm.
They weren't vulnerable or obviously vulnerable. They were going to be successful. They knew what they were doing. They had huge commitment to environmental issues and social justice issues, all wrapped up within the theory and the religious movement of Nos.
And the organisation is clearly working quite well. Paint us a picture of what some of their sort of concerts and events are like.
I think their biggest event was they took what they called their planetary mass to a Greenbelt Christian Festival, which is an annual Christian festival. And in 1992, Nos staged its planetary mass, which is more of a performance than a mass, to 15,000 people in a field in Northamptonshire. And you have Chris Brain in his robes doing his thing. And then at the front of the stage, you have two young women in black sort of lycra bikinis gyrating and spinning. Half the audience seems to be entranced, and half the audience is going, "Oh my God, what's happening here?" And one curate in Sheffield who has been at the festival complains to the bishop, says, "I'm not sure this is altogether appropriate." And he put it in evidence. He said, "I had my ecclesiastical wrists slapped." He was reprimanded. He was told, Brain is doing good work. He's bringing young people into the church. Back off. We're not running a witch hunt against this man.
That's amazing. And at the same time, as you say, as a result of his successes, Chris Brain is gaining quite the reputation in the Church of England, and his ordination is being fast-tracked.
As Nos is moving out of St Thomas's, the parish church, into the city centre to the rotunda at Pond's Forge, they feel they need some sort of structure. The church feels they have to have a minister in there. So somebody hatches this plan to, let's get Brain ordained. He's very keen on the idea. He's initially ordained as a deacon quite quickly in 1991. The next process to become a curate or a priest is supposed to take a couple of years, really. But it's fast-tracked. It's really sped up. And by 1992, he's ordained in a service at Sheffield Cathedral. Now, his tutor on the Northern Theological course, where he's supposed to be completing essays and coursework, and she's like, this guy's not ready. And she's a woman called Marilyn Parry. She's an American. She's now a Church of England minister herself. But she was ringing the alarm bell going, I'm not sure he's doing the coursework or somebody else is doing it for him. He's not completing things on time. He's not turning up for classes. I don't think he's ready to be ordained. And she told this story about how one time he hadn't turned up for one of his sessions, and she rings his house. He lives in this kind of communal house at Parker Street in Sheffield. And the phone is answered by a young woman, and Miss Parry told the court. A woman answered and said he couldn't come to the call because one of the other members of the team was giving him a massage. She says, it didn't seem appropriate behaviour in an ordinand, a trainee priest.
Yeah.
And she was really appalled and thought this man should not become a priest. He's not ready. He's not serious. There's something weird going on. But she was slapped down again and overruled, and it was pushed through, and he was ordained by the Bishop of Sheffield in the cathedral.
That's extraordinary, despite the advice of his tutor. How does being ordained affect him? I mean, does it change his role? Does it change his personality?
I think it emphasises and heightens elements of his personality. So what the ordination service itself, there's something extraordinary about it. He's clearly developing messianic tendencies. So he insists that he's seen the film The Mission with Robert De Niro as a priest. He insists he wants those robes for his ordination.
Robert De Niro's
robes from the film.
Wow.
Now, there are two versions of events of this. He wore the robes. That's what he wore at the ordination. Some people in Nos say that cost £20,000 from church funds, and Nos was also a registered charity. It had a charitable trust and collected money from other charitable giving foundations. Brain says, oh no, they were only borrowed. But more people say they were bought than they were borrowed.
So all sorts of question marks about where the funding is going, I suppose. And what's happening inside the movement? I mean, are behaviours changing?
What's emerged at the trial is very much, you have a picture of people living in kind of separate groups. So you have different teams doing different things, and they don't often mix socially, or they're kind of kept apart. And people have repeatedly testified that this is how they think he kind of maintained control over so many people, because this was getting to be quite a big organisation. So there was a kind of older group who were running the charity, the Nos Trust. There were younger people in the music team, the lighting team, etc. And then you had this quite extraordinary team called the home base team. And the home base team were charged with looking after Chris Brain and his wife and their young child and their dog Badger. And they were, with the exception of one, all young women. They invariably wore black, quite often lycra. In the house, they wore lycra and lingerie.
That's just how they went about?
That's how
the
they
uniform?
went. That was kind of the unwritten uniform.
Wow.
And people commented on this quite a lot. They were known as the lycra lovelies. Some people called them the lycra nuns. Brain has apparently referred to them as the postmodern nuns. And they were expected to cook and clean and perform household chores for Chris Brain and his family. And they had an extraordinary set of instructions, the home-based rota, which had instructions on it like, the phone must ring 4 times before it's answered, and you must prepare a lunch for Chris every day, whether he's there or not. And you don't sit down and eat with him unless you're invited to. You can see this man's sort of sense of his own importance growing and growing and growing.
It's an explosive mix, a leader with messianic tendencies, with control over a group of followers told to indulge his every whim. We'll find out what the court heard from the women of the 9 o'clock service. Sean, you've been telling us about how this movement begins, how it gains so much popularity. The Church of England is delighted to see people being attracted to services. The man at the heart of it all, Chris Brain, is fast-tracked for ordination. And yet something clearly is starting to go wrong here.
Yeah.
This sense of a team of lycra lovelies at his home. Having sat through court and having spoken to so many of the people around this case, for you, listening to it, when did it start to feel quite sinister?
Where it becomes quite sinister is the kind of unwritten bit of the home-based team's duties. And it's not just the home-based team. There are other women who are in the sort of higher levels of NOS or very committed members of NOS. People get called late at night and asked to come and help put Chris to bed. And this almost always involves giving Chris a massage, sometimes when his wife is present, sometimes not. And those massages, we heard repeated evidence that they turned into something sexual, short of full sexual intercourse, but touching, rubbing, groping, things that women felt, they say they felt they had to do because Chris is their guru, their priest, their leader. And he's telling them all the time that he's bringing them to empowerment and sexual freedom and lifting their inhibitions and giving them this kind of talk as one woman later put it was all language, it was all talk, just a way of covering up for one man getting his rocks off with 20 or 30 or 40 young women.
And is this something that's being replicated across the movement?
One young woman I spoke to said, and she was very young at the time, and she was interviewed, kind of almost groomed as a member of the home-based team, but she thinks she escaped because she joined quite late in the day, and she was very young. She was only 16, 17, and still at school and still living at home with her mum. She said, I just thought everybody had affairs with everybody else. A lot of these people were married, they were having affairs, there were things going on that made that young woman feel very uncomfortable and very uncertain of her kind of moral compass. But I think that was the case for a lot of the women in Nos who were being sexually exploited. And all of those women felt that they were not in control of their own lives, if that makes sense. This man had established such a kind of psychological hold over them that they were unable to kind of maintain their own marriages or know where the boundaries of consent and abuse were. And it becomes very dark in this way. And if people become concerned, their greatest fear is they'll be ostracized from the group, because this group has become their whole lives. They live for Nos, they live for this weekly service, they live for the social and community activities it does, because it is doing good Christian things in the community at the same time as this is going on. And it's like one man is exploiting his power over these people.
And Sean, I know one of the people you spoke to, and I thought this was a remarkable quote, basically sort of said it was like a Church of England approved sex cult. Everything was about sex, the images, the dress code, the black bikinis, the sermons. It does sort of start to sound quite unhealthy. And, obviously I'm sure Chris Brain would dispute that description, but it does start to sound really quite grim. For the women who you've seen talking about it in court, how did they describe it? Because, one of the things that will have come up is that they would keep going back. They weren't walking away the moment there was inappropriate behaviour.
They invariably describe it as, I didn't feel in control. I feared what would happen if I said no to him. I feared I would lose all my friends. I would lose my group, my social bearing. I didn't know what to do. And there were a couple of women who did raise concerns, and one in particular, back in 1992, she actually went to the Bishop of Sheffield and said, this man is, he's out of control, he's abusing people physically and psychologically. And the bishop took it seriously, referred her to the archdeacon. She told the same story again. The archdeacon then consulted basically Chris Brain's number 2, and he said, oh, she's got mental health problems. And they just dismissed her complaint. But she left and nobody was allowed to speak to her.
For Chris Brain himself, how does he describe what happened? Does he recognise that something had gone wrong?
It's interesting because way back when Nos collapsed in 1995, he told a documentary that he had had improper sexual contact with a large number of women.
For a priest in a church setting, I'd have to say I was involved in improper sexual contact with a number of women.
Things he should not have done as a priest, and he regretted them. In evidence in trial, he has said either he doesn't remember a lot of these incidents, or they were entirely consensual and they were a way of developing sexual freedom and intimacy between friends. And they always happened, he said, within long-term friendships.
Most of the time, if I was involved sexually, it was normally after a period of a long period of developing a close relationship with that person, where the boundaries of cuddling or spending time together or whatever, usually nearly always on a one-to-one, led to increasing sexual activity.
And everybody knew what they were doing and nobody objected at the time. So he still has remained very defensive of his conduct.
And we should say that while 17 charges of sexual abuse have been upheld, he has been found guilty of them, 15 weren't. It's a difficult, nuanced picture.
It is, but 17 counts of indecent assault is a big rap sheet. And that includes 9 of the 13 complainants.
You mentioned the downfall of Nos. The whole thing came crashing down. How exactly did that happen?
It happened because Brian, I think whether because he was feeling the strain of juggling so many illusions, or whether he was ambitious to do greater things, he'd been approached by American preachers to bring the planetary mass and the whole Nos model to San Francisco. And indeed, they did go to San Francisco and they performed the planetary mass in the cathedral in San Francisco. But as he was doing that and focusing on that, and I mean, in some ways that's extraordinary, he gets a lot of money for that. Anita Roddick of the Body Shop donates money, which is used to transport all the kind of NOS sound systems and things to America.
Wow.
He's expecting Jerry Garcia to come to the service of the Grateful Dead. Things like this are going on. His head's in the clouds. But while that's happening, he's losing control of NOS. His mastery of NOS has been all about controlling different people at different times, setting people against each other, not letting them talk to each other, things like that. And as he loses control, people start to go, what has been going on here? A number of women come forward to the Archdeacon and start to repeat what the first woman said back in 1992. This is abusive. It's gone to his head. He's behaving like a guru. He's taking advantage of people. There's multiple sexual exploitation incidents. And the church finally takes it seriously.
And Sean, you described how this is actually now in court so many years later because a number of women went to the police, raised this case. It seems surprising it's taken decades. Did the Church of England not look into it at the time? Was there not an investigation?
No, and there's huge resentment among what I would call the sort of NOS survivor community, because a lot of people have kept in touch with each other. There's huge resentment at the way the church handled it at the time. They say they were told not to make a fuss, not to talk to the press, and not to talk to the police. And the church would handle it, they would get counselling, but basically it was all swept under the carpet. And the Bishop of Sheffield, in the documentary that was made in 1995 when it all collapsed, basically said, sin is always with us.
I mean, sin is with us always. And we live in an age of extraordinarily loose sexual morals. What happened there is something that in certain walks of life happens frequently, lamentable though it may be.
There's nothing we can do about it. I can't see what good an inquiry would do.
If people want to set up an investigation, good luck to them. I don't myself believe it would serve any useful purpose.
Wow.
So they were dismissed, and I think that dismissal has cost a lot of them dearly. I don't know if any of them still go to Church of England churches. One person I spoke to said, I have completely lost my Christian faith because of what happened to me with NOS. And then what happened to me again with the Church of England. They didn't take it seriously. They didn't take us as human beings seriously. They basically covered up for the institution.
And Sean, looking back at that period, it does feel like they were so struck by what seemed like sort of a very charismatic young man who was able to draw in crowds that people weren't asking the right questions. Coming now, with this case suddenly back in the spotlight again, at a time when we've lost the Archbishop of Canterbury over allegations of having covered up or not investigated another sexual abuse scandal, it doesn't look great for the church, does it? I mean,
no.
How is this going down?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Manveen. This is a church that's reeling from one sexual exploitation scandal after another. If you go back to the time this was happening, Peter Ball the Bishop of Gloucester was losing his ministry because of an indecent assault allegation against a young man because of a very charismatic little movement he had run. And he was gradually re-established until criminal charges were brought 10, 15 years ago.
Good evening. The disgraced former Bishop of Lewes, Peter Ball, has been jailed for 32 months at the Old Bailey today for grooming and abusing 18 young men under the guise of Christian instruction over a 15-year period.
We had the John Smythe allegations, the Macon report that followed that. We had the sole survivor allegations, which has an extraordinary thread. There is a minister who was an advisor to Noss, who was then chairman of trustees of sole survivor. And that, again, that
another scandal.
Another scandal, another charismatic preacher abusing his position. And the church seems to have treated each one in isolation, has never really got its safeguarding policies together, has lost an Archbishop of Canterbury, and I think George Carey's reputation as Archbishop at the time keeps coming up again and again and again, because he was there when Peter Ball was there, he's there when Noss collapses. And it's a familiar story. The church protects the institution first, then it looks, what do we do about the victims? And it fails repeatedly. I don't know if anybody in their right mind wants to be the next Archbishop of Canterbury, because there's a huge caseload of this stuff coming on. And one of the cases they will have to deal with is a lot of these women in Noss are going to sue the church. They want redress from the church. They don't just want Chris Brain brought before the criminal courts. They want the church to answer for what it did, and especially for what it failed to do.
Following the trial, the current Bishop of Sheffield, the Right Reverend Pete Wilcox, announced an independent safeguarding review and apologised to the women affected by the 9 o'clock service. He added, "What happened was an appalling abuse of power and leadership that should never have occurred. Where concerns were raised in the past and were not acted upon properly, that was a failing of the church." That was Sean O'Neill, senior writer at The Times. The producer today was Edward Drummond. The executive producer was Kate Lamble. Sound design and theme composition were by Malasetto. And you can read more about both the 9 o'clock service and the trial at thetimes.com with a subscription. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.